2 days after the European Grand Prix, the verdict was delivered in the murder trial of OJ Simpson, which had begun back in January. The verdict was not guilty on both counts, acquitting Simpson of the murder of both his ex-wife Nicole and her friend Ron Goldman the previous June. The trial had been widely televised and had become something of a soap opera, getting more coverage on the big three networks in the US than the Oklahoma City bombing and the war in Bosnia combined. Lead prosecutor Marcia Clark later said people would come up and tell her they loved her show, while Simpson's defence lawyers, including one Rob Kardashian, a close friend of Nicole, were dubbed the Dream Team and could name their price thereafter. Needless to say, then, opinion on the verdict was hugely divided, with polls showing that African Americans tended to believe Simpson was innocent and white Americans tended to believe he was guilty, though that gap has narrowed since as more details have emerged. That was not the end of the matter, though, as Simpson would now face a civil suit brought by the parents of the victims for wrongful death, but this time the presiding judge ruled that it would not be televised. A few days later, Conservative MP and former Education Minister Alan Howarth defected to the Labour Party, a resignation timed to cause maximum damage to John Major's government, not only coming just days before the party conference, but thus cutting the government's majority to just 7 seats, and to add insult to injury, Howarth had been a staunch supporter of Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s. Alan Howarth MP, by the way, not to be confused with Alan Howarth, who at the time was Secretary of the Parliamentary Labour Party, which must have made for some interesting meetings, and indeed both were later ennobled, making the former Tory, Baron Howarth of Newport, and the lifelong Labour man, Baron Howarth. As one final bit of electoral trivia, the last MP to have crossed the House from the Conservative to the Labour benches? Well, that was Max Mosley's dad, Sir Oswald Mosley, who did so in 1920, albeit via a stint as an independent, over the issue of Ireland. And so the F1 circus arrived in Japan for another double-header race, with the Pacific and Japanese Grand Prix taking place a week apart. That hadn't been the original plan. The 1994 Pacific Grand Prix at Aida had been held early in the season, but the Great Hanshin earthquake in early 1995 had affected access to the remote circuit, and it had been rescheduled to take place just before the Japanese Grand Prix at Suzuka. Unfortunately, because Japan was in the middle of a bit of a financial downturn, not least because of said earthquake, most local fans had to choose to go to one race or the other, and understandably chose the track that was more easily accessible, where the racing was better, and there was a fun fair to keep the kids entertained. Which was Suzuka, in case that wasn't clear. Not only that, but Fuji TV were a major sponsor of the Japanese Grand Prix and refused to broadcast live from Aida, showing it only at 11:45 p.m. local time. Hajime Tanaka, the owner of the track, treated Bernie Ecclestone and the F1 bigwigs to a big official dinner in Sayama, but it was difficult to disguise the fact that, in commercial terms at least, the 1995 Pacific Grand Prix was a bit of a disaster before a wheel had turned. All of which meant that if, as seemed likely, Michael Schumacher did wrap up his second driver's title here, he'd be doing it in front of just 15,000 at the track, though his sponsors would be delighted, as there were mild 7 banners and posters out around the back of the circuit. Japan Tobacco keen to get the most out of their association with Schumi before he left for Ferrari. He'd made his first visit to Maranello not long after the European Grand Prix, where he'd been given a tour of the workshops and shown the still top-secret V10 engine that the team were developing for next year. As anyone with motor racing in his blood would, he came away starry-eyed, proclaiming himself already 100% Ferrari. With most of the important driver moves for 1996 already having been sorted out, there was still a bit of a scramble to sort out those drivers and teams where the size of the sponsorship rather than the magnitude of the talent was the operative thing, and Pedro Diniz was on manoeuvres. Having become, at the last race in Germany, the last driver in F1 history to date to use a manual gearbox, the 40 team having finally got their semi-automatic ones now for the rest of the season, the ambitious Pedro didn't think the team in yellow would enable him to progress in the sport, and was offering his dad's $8 million in Parmalat sponsorship to whoever could promise him better. And it emerged in Japan he'd been talking to Flavio Briatore and Tom Walkinshaw about a drive at Ligier. The French press were horrified. The team was supposed to have solid financial backing from the French state via Gitane and were ambitious to move up the rankings, but things were not as they seemed. Their other major financial partner, Elf, was still wavering and wanted to pull out. Walkinshaw had one last card to play, though. Elf's golden boy, Olivier Panis, had an awful run of form of late. He'd spun out of the last 3 races and had only scored 1 point in Hungary in the second half of the season so far. Walkinshaw would be well within his rights to fire him and look for a new driver, unless, of course, his backer Elf was still financing the team. Elf's head may have been turned, of course, by Jean-Paul Driot, whose new F1 team, Dams, had officially launched on the 6th of October at the Circuit Bugatti at Le Mans, the team's HQ. The GDO1, designed by Rob Arnott and Claude Galopin, had prominent Elf sponsorship. Indeed, they were the only sponsor on the car at this stage. Jan Lammers and Eric Comas were announced as the drivers, with Emmanuel Coulthard as test driver, with testing scheduled at the team's home track for late in October, though pundits noted that the car did look kind of basic, a testament to having been originally designed in early 1994, before the change in regulations following Imola, and much of the development funding since then had gone into adapting the car for the new regulations. Also, as viewer Andrew Good606 pointed out, that I was a bit previous with announcing Johnny Herbert at Sauber for 1996. Either I misread my source, which was in French to be fair, or the source had it wrong. So, spoilers I guess, Johnny Herbert does get that seat for 1996, but as far as everyone in Japan was concerned, that was still open, and indeed it was being reported that Herbert might be talking to Tyrrell about taking Katayama's seat, with the Japanese driver still not confirmed for next year. Back to this year, and Damon Hill had given interviews to the press conceding the title to Schumacher, though mathematically he could still win. He'd been given an absolute battering in the British press for bottling it. That's wimping out for international viewers. As we would say today, Schumacher was living in Hill's head rent-free, they said, and Damon had cracked under the pressure. The press coverage praised his sportsmanship, which they contrasted with Schumacher's alleged ruthlessness, but it seemed, they said, to be proof that nice guys finished second, and some papers were reporting that Williams were even planning to fire Hill and hire Heinz-Harald Frentzen or even Gerhard Berger over the winter, which would mean an expensive contract buyout, but maybe they were willing to do that. Moreover, by the time Damon touched down in Japan, Frank and Patrick's shiny new toy, Jacques Villeneuve, had completed nearly 1,000 kilometres of testing at Silverstone, Monza, Imola and Magny-Cours. And Damon's race engineer, David Brown, who'd been with the Williams team since the early 80s, had just signed up for McLaren in 1996, reuniting with David Coulthard, whose car he'd run in those first post-Senna days before Damon had pulled rank and got the lead driver team assigned to himself. Damon went to Patrick Head with his concerns and was told the team retained full confidence in him for 1996, but that didn't seem to help much, nor did the pain from the hairline fracture on one knee that he'd sustained when hitting the tyre wall at the Nürburgring. He was left telling journalists that all he really wanted to do now was end the season with a couple of wins and remind everyone that he was still a challenger for next year. If Hill was in low spirits, those of Max Papis were even lower. He'd flown all the way out to Japan, only to find that his sponsorship deal had run out and Jackie Oliver had recalled Gianni Morbidelli. That was one of several driver changes for the Pacific Grand Prix because, as usual, the teams at the back of the grid were taking the opportunity of the end of the European season to get a few more quid through the door courtesy of pay drivers, but the authorities had their own opinion on this. Jean-Denis Delatraz's sponsorship cheque had bounced, again, so his 5-race contract was terminated after 2, quote, "On ability alone, we were not willing to keep him," deadpanned Keith Wiggins. The team had planned to offer the seat for Japan to Katsumi Yamamoto, who was doing really well in Japanese F3000, but he was denied a super license. As was Hideki Noda, who'd actually driven 3 races in 1994 for Larousse, and who'd been lined up to replace Roberto Moreno at 40 for the 2 Japanese rounds. When Pupo heard the news, it was Wednesday evening and he was still in Monte Carlo. He got on a helicopter to Nice, then flew to Paris, then to Hong Kong, then to Tokyo, and finally out to Aida, where he arrived, jet-lagged, late on Thursday. This was all happening simultaneously, otherwise you'd imagine Guido Forti and Max Papis could probably have worked something out between them. So, with Gianni Morbidelli back in the footwork, Bertrand Gachot back in the Pacific, Aguri Suzuki back in the Ligier for the 2 Japanese rounds, and Roberto Moreno never actually having left 40, things were taking a surprisingly familiar-looking turn, but there was one new face in the paddock. Mika Hakkinen had come down with appendicitis and had an emergency appendectomy 8 days before the race and was ordered to take a week off. He would be back in the cockpit for Suzuka, but in the meantime Ron Dennis gave the seat to test driver Jan Magnussen, making him the first Dane to enter a Grand Prix since Jack Nellerman failed to qualify for the 1976 Swedish Grand Prix, and assuming nothing dreadful happened in qualifying, the first Dane to start a Grand Prix since Tom Belser at the 1974 Swedish Grand Prix, which coincidentally had also been the first time a Finnish driver had started a Grand Prix too, in that case one Leo Kinnunen. Car number 8, Jan Magnussen. When Tom Belzer made his Grand Prix debut at Anderstorp, Jan Magnussen was just over a year old, the son of 2 police officers in Roskilde. He started racing motocross but switched to karts at age 11, apparently because it hurts less when you fall off. By 14 he was the junior karting world champion, clearly a natural talent, and at 18 he made his open-wheel debut in Formula Ford 1600, moving to England in 1992 at the age of 19, leaving behind infant son Kevin. The risk reaped rewards as Jan finished 3rd overall in British FF 1600 and won the prestigious Formula Ford Festival. A spell in Formula Vauxhall Opel followed, but his big break came when Paul Stewart Racing offered him 2 races in F3 in 1993, which he finished 4th and 3rd, and then took him on full-time for 1994, pairing him with Dario Franchitti. First time out he finished 3rd, and then went on to win 14 of the 18 rounds, breaking Ayrton Senna's 1983 record. At Macau in 1994 he crashed in qualifying, so only started 18th, but charged through the field to place 5th in the first heat and win the second, which put him 3rd overall and 7 seconds on aggregate ahead of Franchitti. With Paul Stewart's illustrious father, Sir Jackie, prophesying great things for the young Dane, he was offered a McLaren testing berth for 1994, while Mercedes entered him in the 1995 German touring car season to hone his racecraft. Dennis didn't think he was ready to take the wheel when Hakkinen picked up a 1-race ban in 1994, giving the seat to Philippe Alliot instead to keep Peugeot happy, but after another year's experience, finishing 8th overall in the DTM and 2nd in the concurrent International Touring Car Championship behind a dominant Bert Schneider, he was judged ready for a go. His fellow DTM competitor Keke Rosberg, who was also Hakkinen's manager of course, gave him the good news at the last race of their season, the week before Aida at Hockenheim. Magnussen and Dennis were probably not expecting a lot, given Jan had had restricted testing time. The longest run he'd had at the MP410 was 4 laps, but given the way the car's design was still in flux, that probably didn't matter as much as it might have, and Jan was clear that he was regarding the whole thing as an experience. This week's version of the McLaren had put the gearbox, suspension and aerodynamics, including the mid-wing, from the B onto the C chassis. Elsewhere in the paddock, Benetton had a new rear suspension, Jordan had that extra wing from Germany on Irvine's car but a redesigned more traditional wing on Barrichello's, Ferrari had fiddled with the rear wheel fairings a bit, and Ligier had modified the underside of the JS41 with longer end plates, and the number 9 footwork, now with Morbidelli, had a whole new front end, suspension, aero and brake calipers, while at the other end the single low exhaust pipe had been replaced by 2 blowing across the diffuser, though this was quickly abandoned when the new assembly fell apart. And of course the Japanese engine manufacturers had pulled out all the stops. Mugen Honda had a new C-spec engine in the back of the Ligier, apparently providing more flexible power response at the low end, potentially useful on this slow track, while Yamaha had introduced a brand new V10 in all but designation, lighter and more compact, and putting out a claimed 650 HP. So there was hope that Ukio Katayama, back in Tyrrell after his week off, might do a bit better, and there was always the chance that Taki Inoue might shine more at home. But the home fans, of course, were much more interested in the return of superstar Aguri Suzuki to the Ligier cockpit. According to my contract, I was supposed to compete in 8 Grand Prix. I'm already at 10. I'm available for events, shrugged Martin Brundle, promoted to the team's technical advisor for the duration, which evidently gave him time to rejoin Murray Walker and Jonathan Palmer in the BBC commentary box. Speaking of superstars in Japan, Jean Alesi was known there primarily as that racing driver guy that Kumiko Goto is seeing. His Japanese girlfriend was a well-known singer and actress and had recently starred opposite Jackie Chan in 1993 action comedy City Hunter, which is worth a watch if Jackie Chan dressed as the characters from Street Fighter and doing all their signature moves sounds like your kind of thing. Poor Roberto Moreno was spotted asleep on a packing crate on Friday morning as the 40 mechanics got the car ready for free practice. Schumacher was fastest in that session, but in the afternoon's first qualifying session it was once again the new Williams that was the class of the field, and once again David Coulthard getting the most out of it, a 10th quicker than Hill and 3/10 quicker than Schumacher, who was suffering from oversteer, while Panis compounded his shaky status at Ligier by being slower than both Aguri Suzuki and his fellow French midfielder Bouillon, while a jet-lagged Moreno still managed to be nearly a second quicker than his own teammate. Benetton decided overnight that rather than going all out to get pole, that they would spend Saturday's session fine-tuning Schumacher's setup for the race, safe in the knowledge that a mere 4th place would make him champion. Meanwhile, the track organisers had tarmacked the area just outside the last corner, as Jean Alesi and several others had put a wheel over there and spread dust all over the place. You certainly couldn't fault Tanaka and Co for wanting to make everything run smoothly. Hill went faster on Saturday, but he couldn't beat Coulthard's Friday time, never mind the Scots' Saturday time, which ended the day exactly 0.2 faster. So whatever happened next year, McLaren were clearly getting a demon qualifier. Hill was second, but that meant starting on the dirty side of the track, while Schumacher on the second row would have the better side in terms of surface. Next up were the Ferraris, Alesi beating Berger, who finished Saturday in a gravel trap, with another fine performance from Irvine in 6th. Herbert was 7th, still 1.3 seconds off his teammate, lining up alongside Frentzen, who was just 0.003 slower. Panis dug deep and improved on Saturday to qualify an encouraging 9th, ahead of Blundell, who found the McLaren just as difficult to drive at this slow, twisty circuit as the last one. The new boy Magnussen didn't put a wheel wrong in any of the sessions and lined up 12th, the two McLarens bracketing a disappointed Barrichello. Suzuki ended up 13th. Lamy put in a good time on Saturday to go 14th ahead of Bouillon, with Katayama rewarding his fans by beating Salo for once. Morbidelli was 19th, still getting the hang of the car again after some time off and a lot of modifications, but nonetheless having the beating of Inoue, who spun twice. And at the back, the usual suspects, with the 40s convincingly ahead of the Pacifics. Diniz getting the better of his teammate on Saturday, and Gasho, like Morbidelli, a bit rusty. In an effort to conserve sets of tyres, some drivers took to the warm-up on wets, since the sun was still beating down as it had all weekend and they weren't likely to need them for the race. Following the European Grand Prix, the FIA had issued a clarification on the rules around overtaking, saying that drivers could defend their positions as they saw fit, quote, provided they do not deliberately endanger another driver or repeatedly obstruct him on a straight, which was welcome news for most, even if in practice that was what everyone had been doing anyway. No problems before the start for Coulthard this time out, as he started his 4th consecutive race from pole position and once again made the perfect start, with Schumacher going round the outside of Hill into turn 2, but Damon moved over, forcing him onto the curbs, all of which let Alesi through into second, and Berger passed Schumacher as well. So as Coulthard started to immediately pull away, he was being chased by Alesi, Hill, Berger, Schumacher down in 5th, and Herbert, who'd got past Irvine in the first couple of turns. Behind Irvine was Frentzen, and then the two McLarens running in formation, Blundell taking a look at the Sauber occasionally. By the end of the lap, Coulthard was already 2.8 seconds ahead of Alesi, and both Ferraris had a car attached firmly to their gearbox and were clearly holding them up. Coulthard's lead was up to 4 seconds on lap 2, as Bertrand Gachot became the first retirement with a gearbox hydraulic problem. Hill was definitely being held up by Alesi and just couldn't seem to get past, as Coulthard continued romping away into the distance. On lap 5, Schumacher at least got past his Ferrari just before the hairpin, and 2 laps later he was on Hill's tail, and more importantly for him, was now in the 4th position that was all he needed to be Grand Champion. But Schumacher wouldn't have been Schumacher if he'd decided to just sit back and drive to a 4th place finish, so he was keen to get past both of the two ahead of him and set off after Coulthard, while Berger was now under attack from Herbert. Jean-Christophe Bouillon exited into the gravel during an off-screen tussle with Pedro Lamy over 14th place, by which time Coulthard's lead was now 13 seconds, and Schumacher was increasingly eager to get past Hill and Alesi. He had a go at the end of the long straight on lap 11, but, evidently having taken the new FIA guidance to heart, Hill moved over to force him wide, then outbraked him into the corner. At the end of the lap, local hero Suzuki binned his Ligier, which brought out the yellow flags while the marshals cleared the car away. Coulthard, then the Alesi-Hill-Schumacher train, started lapping the back markers, beginning with the 40s. Martin Brundle commenting on the BBC that when you're in the race they're called 40s because there seem to be about 40 of them, while further back Magnussen was conducting a spirited defence of 10th place from Barrichello, with Panis behind the pair and presumably hoping for a coming together. Anyone on a 3-stop strategy would expect to be coming in shortly, and Hill and Schumacher both seem to have settled back to await developments in the pit stops, while Alesi seemed to have stabilised the gap and even closed it a little, now 12.7 seconds behind Coulthard. The Williams and Ferrari mechanics were out in the pits as the trio came up to lap Inoue, and Hill made an opportunistic move at turn 1, only for Alesi to close the door on him, because that's never gone wrong before. The tyres the Williams mechanics were preparing had DHL on them. For Damon Hill, they hadn't been couriered overnight, and indeed next time around all of the 3 musketeers came in together. With the cameras not really sure where to look and the graphics only able to show 2 times at once, it was Schumacher, 6 seconds stationary, who got out first, followed by a lazy, 7 seconds, and then Hill getting going after 12 thanks to his left rear not wanting to engage. So Schumacher rejoined right in front of Eddie Irvine, with a lazy slotting in 7th behind Frentzen, and Hill ending up 9th behind Blundell, though only until he came in next time around. Magnussen's first F1 pit stop went well, as Hill made his way past Frentzen to get on a lazy's tail again, as the Ferrari was still stuck behind Irvine, while Berger and Herbert had pitted and emerged behind that group, promoting Schumacher to 2nd, with Irvine now 3rd. A lazy finally forced his way past Irvine at the end of lap 24, braking very late and forcing Eddie wide, but when Hill tried to follow through there was no room, and he tapped the Jordan's right rear wheel, bending the end plate on his own front wing. Just then Coulthard came in from a 32-second lead, an 11-second stop suggesting that he was the first of the 2 stoppers to come in, and left still ahead of Schumacher by 7.5 seconds. At the same time Irvine came in, putting Hill back up to 4th, but he was suffering understeer thanks to his bent front wing. The Williams team had a new nose ready in case he felt it was worth taking the time to change, but for now he was right up with the lazy once more. Schumacher, meanwhile, had taken advantage of his lighter fuel load to start closing relentlessly on Coulthard, arriving behind the Williams on lap 33, but the trick now would be getting past, because he was planning to make one more stop. If Coulthard could drive defensively and keep Schumacher behind him, he would have the advantage, but that, of course, was much easier said than done, even on a tight track like this. Half a minute behind, Hill was still unable to get past a lazy in front of him, as on lap 37, Schumacher came in for his 2nd stop, a little bit earlier than planned, with a bit more fuel going in to compensate, but he still left the pits in 2nd place, now 20 seconds behind Coulthard, who was just approaching the race-long battle for 10th between Barrichello and Magnussen, and watched Rubens take the place as he approached. The next time round, Hill came in from behind a lazy, getting out behind Berger, and then it was a lazy on the following lap for a vital stop for Ferrari. It was slightly quicker on the jacks, but not quite quick enough, as the Williams went flashing past the end of the pit lane as a lazy emerged, having lost 3 seconds across his in-lap and the pit stop. Schumacher was charging again, setting a new fastest lap on lap 40 of the 81, which was as far as local boy Inouye was going, coasting to a stop with a dead engine from 18th place. Mark Blundell, meanwhile, had made a 2nd stop, but was having a unique problem of his own. Some problem with his drink bottle had squirted it in his eyes, and it was stinging like billy-o, causing the unfortunate Mark to have to squint and blink a lot. Berger came in for his stop, a quick one, promoting Hill and Lazy back into 3rd and 4th. Schumacher was taking a second a lap off Coulthard's lead as the Scot made his way through traffic, and by lap 44 he had it back down to 14 seconds from 20 when he'd come out of the pits. Berger at that point overtook a lazy at the hairpin with an uncharacteristic lack of fight from the Frenchman, which made the pundits wonder if there'd been some team orders, while Coulthard was approaching the back of Irvine and Frentzen, who were scrapping over 7th and lapping Katayama at the same time. David knew he was losing time behind the pair of them and made his displeasure felt, and Williams decided to bring him in before he lost too much more, the gap down to 8 seconds before he finally got past Frentzen. A longish 11.8 second stop would see Coulthard good on fuel to the end of the race, but Schumacher had gone past and indeed now had a lead of 14 seconds with a lighter fuel load. Now all he needed to do was stretch that gap enough to make one more stop and still emerge in the lead. A picture outage from Japan was resolved just in time to see Irvine pit, and Frentzen came in the next time around, and when the dust had settled on that round of stops, HH had got ahead of both Irvine and Panis. By lap 55, Schumacher had a 20-second lead and was pulling out at over 2 seconds a lap, while Hill was slowly reeling in his teammate, from a position about the same distance behind. Lazy had dropped back from Berger and was now coming under threat from Johnny Herbert in the second Benetton, and came in for his third stop on lap 57. Berger's stop the next lap was slightly slower, but he still regained the track in 4th place ahead of his teammate. And then on lap 59 Schumacher came in for his crucial third stop, by which time his lead was 22 seconds. It was going to be tight, but the Benetton crew did their usual excellent work and the car was out on track over 4 seconds ahead of Coulthard, as Hill came in for his third and final stop from a pretty distant third. With his tyres up to temperature, Schumacher started to once again walk away into the distance on rubber that was another 9 laps fresher than David's, as Herbert, who'd moved up to 4th when the Ferraris had pitted, now pitted himself and rejoined behind them again. Flavio Briatore on the pit lane looked tense, but at this point the only thing that could stop Michael Schumacher taking the win and the title was a mechanical problem or some indiscretion while lapping someone. By this point the leader had lapped everyone up to and including 5th place to Lazy, and Hill could well end his mathematical title hopes by trailing in a lap down. He was currently 52 seconds behind on a 1:16 lap with another 20 to go, and Schumacher was showing no signs of slowing it down or taking it easy. By the time Barrichello's Peugeot engine developed a short circuit and he balled off on the grass on lap 69, most of the interest had, in all honesty, gone out of the race, with the only real battle being Johnny Herbert's pursuit of a Lazy for 5th, the gap between them currently around 4 seconds. Indeed, it would be another bad day for Jordan, as Eddie Irvine picked up a puncture on his right rear a few laps later. He managed to get round to the pits for a new set of boots, but dropping from 8th to 11th and well out of contention. Fortunately for Eddie Jordan, it didn't look like McLaren were going to be scoring today either, but Frentzen was closing in on Herbert with an eye on that last point, which would take the Sauber team to within 2 of the Woking Wonders and just above Jordan. Schumacher disposed of 4th place Berger on lap 72, meaning it was only the podium places now unlapped, and with a relatively low number of retirements there were still quite a few slower cars on the track ahead, so Williams could yet hope for some miscommunication, especially as rookie Jan Magnussen was next on the menu, running just behind his teammate. The McLarens held Schumacher up enough to allow Coulthard to close up a bit, but not enough to worry the champion designate, and as soon as he was through he got his foot down and pulled the gap out again, Hill having also done enough to get himself out of danger of being lapped. With 3 laps to go, Herbert was right on a Lazy's tail off screen, with Frentzen closing up too, but the TV director was understandably concentrating on Michael Schumacher coming home to take the win at a canter and be crowned the 1995 World Drivers' Champion. Coulthard came home 2nd, and Damon Hill trailed in 3rd, giving a wave to the fans, the Ferraris 4th and 5th, a Lazy not having a particularly memorable 100th Grand Prix, with Herbert taking the final point, which was the one to nudge Benetton just 1 more point ahead on the constructors' race. Someone handed Schumacher an upside-down German flag to wave, but if he noticed, he didn't care. He'd won the race the same way he'd won the title, not by having the fastest car necessarily, but by being the best driver and his team repeatedly having the tactical beating of everyone else. Schumacher, still clutching his upside-down flag, took to the podium alongside a pensive Coulthard and a dejected Hill, though their efforts had at least kept the team in the hunt for the constructors' title, the gap between them now 21 points, with 32 on offer across the last 2 races. It was good news either way for Renault, who'd now won more races than Honda, 72 to 71, and while we're doing statistics, this was both the 25th win and 75th podium for Benetton as a constructor. 18 of those 25 wins had come courtesy of the man on top in 1995, new champion Michael Schumacher.